All right, welcome back. Tonight, we're not diving into a battle or a fallen empire. Instead, we're talking about something that's been quietly riding alongside human civilization for thousands of years: cannabis. That's right. Before it was a dispensary product, a reggae soundtrack, or the subject of a very awkward congressional hearing, it was just a plant. A wildly useful, slightly mysterious, endlessly controversial plant. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy hanging out here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing. Now settle in, turn the lights down low, maybe grab a glass of water, and let's take a slow, easy trip through one of history's most underrated stories. No rush. We've got time. Part 1. The Stone Age. Around 5000 BC. Let's set the scene. It's roughly 5000 BC. Civilization is basically in its early access phase. Glitchy, unfinished, and nobody's written the manual yet. People are figuring out farming, making pottery, and dying from things that modern Americans treat with a $2 pill. Somewhere in what's now Siberia, a forager probably tossed some cannabis plant onto a campfire for warmth, breathed in a little too deeply, and completely forgot what they were doing outside. Archaeologists have actually found cannabis seeds buried in ancient graves, which tells us one thing very clearly: somebody thought this plant was important enough to bring into the afterlife. Whether that was a spiritual ritual or just prehistoric, don't bury me without my stash energy, we honestly can't be sure. Given human nature, probably both. Here's the thing though, cannabis wasn't about getting lit in 5000 BC. It was a survival tool. The fibers made rope and clothing. The seeds were edible and nutritious. It was basically nature's Swiss Army knife. You could sail with it, tie stuff with it, wear it, and if you accidentally inhaled too much smoke from the campfire, suddenly feel very philosophical about the moon. Imagine being the first human to really feel that effect. No context, no explanation, no snacks. Just the sudden, bewildering sensation that the universe just got about 30% more interesting. Early humans probably assumed the gods had upgraded reality, and in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. Something had definitely shifted. From that confused first inhale, a legend was born. A plant that would eventually circle the globe, inspire poetry, trigger federal raids, and keep late-night talk show writers employed for decades. All starting with one curious Neolithic person who wanted to see what would happen if they set the bushes on fire. Before the word weed existed in any language, cannabis had already figured out the ultimate survival strategy: convince the smartest species on the planet to grow it, protect it, worship it, and criminalize it, often within the same generation. Well played, plant. Part 2. Ancient China. Around 2700 BC, fast forward to around 2700 BC, China is doing what China has always done: inventing everything before everyone else and then being very calm about it. Paper, silk, organized government, the concept of having a plan, and apparently the world's first medical endorsement for cannabis. Enter Emperor Shen Nong, known as the Divine Farmer, which sounds incredibly noble until you learn that his main method of discovering medicine was personally eating random plants to see which ones would hurt him. The man was essentially a one-person pharmaceutical trial with no ethics board and zero liability coverage. Legend says he cataloged hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng, tea, and yes, cannabis. His ancient text, the Pensao Qing, reads like a Yelp review section for plants. Cannabis? Good for pain, inflammation, forgetfulness, which is impressive since cannabis was likely causing at least some of the forgetfulness he was treating. To Shen Nong, cannabis wasn't a party favor. It was medicine. The Chinese approach was refined. They brewed it into teas, ground it into medicinal powders, and treated it with the same seriousness they gave every other aspect of their civilization. It calmed the nerves, reduced fevers, and probably made people a little too confident about their calligraphy. Hemp was woven through every part of daily life. Literally. It was spun into rope, woven into fabric, pressed into paper. Entire communities were built around the cannabis plant. Your clothes? Hemp. Your fishing nets? Hemp. The paper you wrote your poetry on? Also hemp. It was like living inside the world's most functional garden. Chinese physicians believe cannabis helped balance the body's internal energies, a way of saying it chilled people out without sounding too casual. It wasn't recreational yet, but let's be real. Every culture that starts with, "it's strictly medicinal," usually ends up laughing at shadows by nightfall. Shen Nong may not have had a chemistry degree, but he understood one fundamental truth about human beings. If you can get people to stop complaining for a few hours, you've made a real contribution to civilization. In a world dealing with floods, famines, and neighboring tribes with very large spears, that counts as medical progress. Part 3. The Scythians. Around 1000 BC, while China was carefully documenting cannabis in leather-bound scrolls, the Scythians, nomadic warriors who rode across the open steppes of Central Asia, had a much simpler philosophy. Just burn it and breathe. These were horse-riding, tattoo-covered, absolutely not to be messed with nomads whose attitude can best be described as armed and completely unbothered. Around 1000 BC, the Scythians incorporated cannabis into their funeral rituals. And when I say incorporated, I mean they went all in. Greek historian Herodotus documented this. They would toss cannabis seeds onto red-hot stones inside sealed felt tents, fill the space with thick aromatic smoke, and according to Herodotus, howl with pleasure, which in ancient Greek historian language is basically saying somebody was having a very good time at a funeral. This wasn't a casual puff. It was a full ceremony. A group of warriors, sealed in a tent, steaming cannabis until they felt spiritually realigned. Imagine 20 guys, all decorated with tattoos, wearing fur everything, crawling into a hot tent and emerging 20 minutes later looking very serene and slightly confused about what year it was. For the Scythians, the smoke was sacred. It helped them communicate with the spirits of their ancestors, process grief, and apparently cope with the fact that life on the steppe was cold, brutal, and short. Archaeologists excavating Scythian burial sites actually found golden bongs. Real ones, still coated with cannabis residue. These people went to the afterlife with their gear. That's commitment. That's a vibe. The idea spread. From Persia to the far edges of the ancient world, cultures began using cannabis smoke in ceremonies, funerals, festivals, rites of passage. Because if you're going to question the meaning of life, it helps if the room itself has an opinion. The Scythians didn't invent philosophy. They just found a way to make it feel very urgent. Part 4. Ancient India. Around 1500 BC, if the Scythians made cannabis ceremonial, India made it divine. Because in ancient India, if something was going to be part of the culture, it was going to be all the way in the culture. No half measures. By around 1500 BC, cannabis had earned a place in the Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's 4 most sacred texts. It was listed among the 5 most sacred plants, described as a gift directly from the gods, specifically from Shiva. According to legend, Shiva retreated to the mountains after a difficult day dealing with cosmic drama, rested under a cannabis plant, ate some leaves, and entered a state of profound peace. From that point on, he was associated with the plant, and cannabis became part of his worship. Shiva is still called the Lord of Bhang to this day. That might be the most impressively relaxed religious title in all of human history. Now, bhang wasn't smoked. It was consumed as a drink. Picture a thick spiced mixture of milk, nuts, and cannabis leaves served at festivals and temples. Priests, yogis, and regular worshippers alike would drink it during ceremonies, feel deeply connected to the divine, and then occasionally forget what the ceremony was supposed to be about. This was not considered a failure. This was considered success. Cannabis wasn't shameful. It wasn't rebellious. It was woven into temples, offered to deities, and passed around at religious festivals. Mahashivaratri, one of the holiest nights in the Hindu calendar, involved all-night singing, dancing, and drinking bhang until the universe felt a little more approachable. If enlightenment has a recipe, it was apparently 1 part devotion, 1 part the right leaves, and one part accepting that tomorrow morning was going to feel a little rough. What makes India's relationship with cannabis so fascinating is that it was never pretending to be something else. In China, it was medicine. Among the Scythians, it was ritual. But in India, it was explicitly for joy, transcendence, and genuine spiritual connection. Nobody was being coy about it. The goal was to feel something real, to touch the divine, and somehow a plant helped people get there. Maybe that says something interesting about what we're all actually looking for. Part 5. Taoist China. Around 1000 BC. Meanwhile, back in China, something interesting was happening in the world of Taoism. While Confucian scholars were busy emphasizing discipline, order, and keeping your life carefully organized, Taoist monks were doing something a little different. They were burning cannabis incense during meditation, claiming it helped them open pathways to the spirit world and see beyond ordinary perception. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes described as the liberator of sin, which sounds poetic until you realize the practical effect was probably just making monks very comfortable wandering through forests at odd hours. Taoism was about merging with the natural flow of the universe, becoming one with the great, indescribable everything. Cannabis, they found, made that feel much more achievable, at least for a while. But this being China, even spiritual exploration came with structure. Cannabis wasn't casually lit up. It was carefully measured, combined with specific herbs, documented in scrolls, and used according to established practices. You followed a procedure. You meditated properly. You maintained your dignity, mostly. Ancient China had a remarkable ability to take almost anything and turn it into a protocol. The tension between the Taoists and the Confucians over cannabis use might be history's first recorded drug policy debate. The Taoists argued it expanded consciousness and opened spiritual doors. The Confucians argued it expanded laziness and loosened the social fabric. They never really agreed. And like every drug policy debate since, it ended with people publicly pretending to follow the rules while privately doing what they wanted. What's remarkable is that China managed to make cannabis simultaneously a medical tool, a philosophical instrument, a spiritual technology, and an administrative headache, all at the same time. Only a civilization that invented bureaucracy could turn getting high into a form that needed to be filled out in triplicate. Part 6. Hemp as civilization's backbone. Let's step back for a moment and look at the big picture. Because cannabis wasn't just a spiritual or medicinal curiosity, it was infrastructure. Hemp, the non-psychoactive side of the cannabis plant, was one of the most important industrial materials in the ancient world, and its story is just as wild. In ancient China, hemp fields stretched for miles. The fibers were extraordinarily strong, resistant to decay, and remarkably versatile. Hemp rope held together fishing nets, rigged sailing vessels, and kept heavy loads secure across thousands of trade routes. Hemp cloth was standard for everyday clothing, more durable than linen, longer lasting than most alternatives. And hemp paper? That's what the earliest written records of human civilization were written on. Literally, the knowledge of ancient cultures was preserved on cannabis. Let that land for a second. The oldest books, the oldest medical texts, the oldest poetry and history, written on hemp. Human civilization's entire first draft was typed on weed, metaphorically speaking. Archaeologists have found hemp sandals, hemp bowstrings, and even hemp padding used in ancient armor. There were soldiers marching into battle effectively wrapped in cannabis from head to toe, with no idea they were walking through history's first all-natural gear store. As trade routes expanded, first across Asia, then toward Persia, Egypt, and eventually Europe, hemp traveled right alongside silk and spices. The Persians made rope from it. The Egyptians used it in medicinal ointments and ritual incense. The Greeks characteristically had opinions about it and wrote essays. Everyone needed it. Everyone used it. Hemp was the quiet empire builder. No armies, no conquests, just usefulness spreading from one culture to the next. While kings spent fortunes on gold and armies, hemp just kept growing in every climate, asking nothing, serving everyone. The era of purely practical use was drawing to a close, but only because something more complicated and more interesting was beginning to develop. Part 7. Ancient Persia and the Philosophical Angle. By the time cannabis made its way into ancient Persia, it had already built an impressive resume. Medicine, rope, sacred smoke, funeral ritual. But Persia was going to add something new to the list: philosophy. Because in the ancient Persian world, everything, including plants, was eventually going to end up in a debate about the nature of existence. The Assyrians were among the first in this region to use it regularly, calling it kunubu, a word that linguists believe is a direct ancestor of our modern word cannabis. They burned it in temples not for recreation, but for what they called divine insight. Ancient priest code for, "We're about to have some very unconventional thoughts about the cosmos." When cannabis reached the Zoroastrian mystics of Persia proper, it found a perfect home. Zoroastrianism already had fire altars, cosmic symbolism, and a worldview built around the eternal struggle between light and darkness. What it was missing was a way to make long philosophical discussions feel more manageable. Cannabis helped, smoke rising toward the heavens. In their framework, that was quite literally a prayer being delivered. Ancient accounts describe some Persian priests using cannabis during rituals specifically to free the mind from doubt, which in practical terms meant that after a few minutes of ritual incense, everything suddenly seemed obvious and profound and deeply connected. We've all met someone who has this effect on parties. Predictably, the ruling class started getting nervous. Because if ordinary people could access the divine on their own terms, without paying the temple, without going through the proper authorities, what did that mean for the social order? Cannabis began its long and complicated career as a substance that's respected in private and condemned in public, a tradition that, as Americans are well aware, continued well into the 21st century. Persian traders carried cannabis westward along the Silk Road, where it gathered new names and new associations with every culture it passed through. By the time it reached Greece, it wasn't just a plant anymore. It was an idea, portable, adaptable, impossible to fully control, which honestly describes most powerful ideas. Part 8. Ancient Egypt. Egypt in its prime was a civilization running on divine bureaucracy. The gods had defined roles, the pharaoh was a living deity, the priests managed access to the sacred, and everyone, from the highest nobleman to the worker hauling limestone blocks under the desert sun, was operating inside a very specific system. Into this came cannabis, a small mercy for a culture that had been building enormous things in extreme heat for 3,000 years. The Egyptians, being practical people, used cannabis medically. It shows up in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever discovered, dating back about 3,500 years. Cannabis appears as a treatment for inflammation, pain, eye conditions, and, this is completely real, bad temper. That last application alone might have prevented several ancient wars. Imagine if pharaohs had had access to that prescription. Priests were the main gatekeepers of cannabis use. They combined it with other substances to make balms, oils, and ritual incense used during temple ceremonies. The idea was that sacred smoke created a bridge between the human and divine, the scent carrying prayers upward to the gods. Whether or not that worked theologically, it certainly made the temple feel more atmospheric. Cannabis found its way into the afterlife as well. Archaeologists have discovered traces of it in mummy wrappings and burial chambers, which tells us plainly that someone decided, wherever I'm going, this comes with me. Can't really argue with that logic. Eternity is a long time. Best to be prepared. Egyptian women used it too. Ancient midwives prescribed cannabis to ease the pain of childbirth, which without modern medicine was an extraordinarily dangerous event. You work with what you have, and cannabis apparently helped. Royal households used cannabis ointments to treat the migraines and chronic aches that came with wearing heavy crowns and managing vast empires. Even being a pharaoh came with occupational hazards. The Egyptians didn't treat cannabis as exotic or dangerous. It was simply part of how you managed a difficult world. When your climate is punishing, Your building projects are never-ending, and your gods have very specific requirements. A plant that reduces pain and calms the mind starts to look like a practical necessity rather than an indulgence. Egypt built monuments. Egypt also built coping strategies. Both have lasted. Part 9. Ancient Greece. By the time cannabis drifted into ancient Greece, the Greeks had already perfected two national pastimes that have survived to the modern day: arguing and drinking. Cannabis, with its tendency to encourage long, wandering, deeply felt conversations, was practically tailor-made for this civilization. Greek physicians took it seriously as medicine. Hippocrates and Dioscorides both documented cannabis in their medical writings, praising its usefulness for pain, inflammation, and what Dioscorides called pain of the inner self, which might be the oldest recorded diagnosis of existential dread in Western medicine. So in a sense, ancient Greeks were already aware that cannabis helped with anxiety. They just had a more poetic way of putting it. The Greeks didn't make cannabis a central part of their religious practice the way India had, and they didn't hotbox their tents the way the Scythians did. Their relationship with it was more intellectually curious. They knew it existed. They wrote about it. Their physicians used it. And at symposia, those famous Greek dinner parties where wine flowed freely and everyone debated philosophy until sunrise, there's reasonable evidence that cannabis was part of the atmosphere. Picture it: a torch-lit room, several philosophers reclining on couches, cups of wine in hand, and someone